So I have some examples that I want to walk through with you about making queries to the database. And it sounds silly, but there are actually a lot of different ways to write select statements and to deal with particularly prepared queries. If you use the PDO query method directly, behind the scenes that's actually doing two steps. It does a prepare and then an execute. So even though you don't have any placeholders, you're not asking PDO to prepare the statement, it will do that for you nonetheless. These prepared statements that I mentioned they're a real feature. I think PDO with prepared statements is absolutely the right way to use databases from PHP today. The prepared statement simply means that we write an SQL statement as we usually would, and we denote which parts of the SQL statement will be replaced by variable data before it's run. This gives the database an opportunity to get that statement optimized and ready to go, but it also means that we've said this is variable data. So MySQL will escape that for us. We don't need to wrap it in real escape string. We don't need to remember to do anything. Those variables, because we've marked them as variables, will be escaped before they are passed to MySQL. This makes it much harder to open yourself to SQL injection, which is fabulous news. The other benefit of a prepared statement is if you are running the same statement multiple times, you can prepare it once and run it lots of times, perhaps in a loop. For subsequent runs, you'll get an improved performance time. So if you prepare it once, it's more efficient to run it lots and lots of times. Hopefully you're not repeating queries a lot in your application, but you might need to. So that's really, really handy. So I have some examples that I want to show you of making queries, and we'll start with a really simple one. For all of these, I'm using a films database, which is actually based on the MySQL Sequila database, which is their training database. So you can download it and try this yourself if you want. It's a publicly available resource. So walk through this code example with me. First of all, we instantiate a PDO object. We pass in the DSN for my local MySQL database, and we pass in the username and the password. Hasten to add that my username is not really username, my password is not really password. We write the SQL statement, and here I'm just doing select star from country. So everything which is in the country table, we're just going to select. I've got my database connection, I've got my SQL statement. Now have a look at line 6. I'm writing this $stmt, it's short for statement. This is just a convention, it's all over the PHP documentation, seems to be a habit that I've picked up myself. And that's because the return value of the database query method is a PDO statement object, that's the class name. So I run the query, pass in the SQL, have a look at line 7. All I'm doing here is, inside a while loop, I'm calling fetch and assigning it to $row. Assignment returns the value that gets assigned. So if I call fetch and there's nothing there, then fetch will return false. So if there's 3 rows in the country table, I'll get 1 country, 2 countries, 3 countries, and the next time I call fetch, I'll get false. And at that point, the while statement will cease. Inside the while statement, I'm just echoing the countries. So if we run this from the command line while we're looking at it, I get a big list of countries. These are the countries that are in the Sequila database. Pretty straightforward, no placeholders in that one. Let's move on and look at a select statement which has some variable data in it. Exactly the same connection details as before, but this time my SQL statement, have a look at line 5, my SQL statement selects everything from the film table where the title equals question mark. Now the question mark, when you put it in an SQL statement, has a special meaning. It's a placeholder. So once I've got that, I can't just directly run it as a query as I did in the previous example, because MySQL doesn't know what should go in place of the question mark. So instead, I said that query does prepare and then execute. In this case, we're going to run those 2 steps ourselves. First of all, we prepare that SQL. When we execute it, we supply the data that we want to use to run it. Now this is sample data, so if you download the Sequila database, you'll see that it's full of absolutely hilarious film names. So I use Antitrust Tomatoes as my example film name. There are some other really excellent ones in there. Do feel free to have a look. So we execute that statement, and I've also set the fetch mode here. That's just because the default fetch mode is PDO fetch both, which gives me every column twice, once in associative array with the column name as the key, and once with an enumerated key, so they come back in the order of the columns. It's not all that useful, so I typically will set the fetch mode to fetch ASOC, which gives me an associative array with the column name to match the key name in the array. There's that while loop again, and all I'm doing here is doing a print R on the row. Actually, there's only one film called Antitrust Tomatoes. So if I run this, select placeholder, then you can see back comes the film ID and all the various columns that are associated with it. In our SQL statement, we have the question mark, that's the placeholder. We prepare the statement, and when we run it, we just supply what should be in that placeholder. If we have more than one placeholder, then we can do that too. So I have an example which filters by both title and language. So I'm only interested in Antitrust Tomatoes films where the language ID is 1, which is English. Have a look at the SQL statement. 2 question mark placeholders. And what that means is that we need to supply the data to execute in an array with the elements in the correct order. So in the order in which the question marks appear in the SQL, that's the order in which the elements should appear in the enumerated array that we pass to execute. The rest is just the same. So we set the fetch mode, we do the while loop, and just call fetch each time we go round the loop. The question marks are fine, but they become very unwieldy when you're dealing with large, complicated SQL statements, or even some that are built up over a number of little conditional clauses. However, the PDO extension supports named placeholders, which I think is much nicer. So let's have a look at that. Here is the example with the named placeholders. Have a look at the SQL statement on line 5. We've got select star from film where title equals :film and language ID equals :lang. So that colon notation denotes that this is a placeholder. So we need to supply something to go in each of those places. Again, we prepare the statement, let the database know we're going to run this statement, stand by, and then we call execute with the data intact. And we're still passing an array, but this time we need to give the keys, and the keys need to match the placeholders. So I'm giving the film name, I'm giving the language, setting the fetch mode, running the while loop, running the fetch statement, and the data comes back. I find the named placeholders a much easier way of creating maintainable SQL. So that's quite cute. And it's much easier if you have fields that might be there depending which filter you passed into this model method or whatever. Very clean and tidy way of doing it. So that's really the main stuff I wanted to show you, but I have a couple of extra tricks that you might be interested in seeing. So let's just jump in quickly and have a look at those. Here's the bind value method. So I'm running the same SQL again with the named placeholders for both film and language. And we prepare that statement, we set the fetch mode. But if you look at the execute command on line 11, we're not passing any data into it. Instead, what we do is we get all of that data in place beforehand using bind value. So we bind to the lang variable the value 1, and to the film variable the value Academy Dinosaur. Told you there were some good film names in this. We run the fetch, we print a row. We can then rebind one of the values, but We don't need to rebind them both. We prepare the SQL, it gives us a PDO statement, we bind some values. You can rebind one of those values and run execute again. You can imagine doing this in a loop, can't you? Bind the value, run execute, bind the value, run execute. You don't have to rebind them all, and you don't need to supply them all at execute time. So that's quite a neat trick. One more improvement on that then, before I wrap up on this section, is a bit like bind value, but we use a method called bind param. Have a look at lines 11 and 12. It's the same SQL statement. We've got film, we've got lang. I'm binding them to variables. So I set some variables, and that's right up the top here on lines 3 and 4. I hope this isn't too weird to follow. Then further down, lines 11 and 12, we use those variables and we bind them against the named placeholders in the PDO statement SQL. Later on, we can just rebind one of them. I don't call bind param again. So we bind them once, we run execute here, then just update the value of the variable. Bind param links the named placeholder to that variable name. So when you update the variable, let's say you're going around a for each loop, when you update that variable, the next time you execute, the new value gets used. Can occasionally be a really nice trick, so I thought I would share.